Thank you for your patience. Let us now begin panel discussion 5, titled The Future of Women's Health, Innovations and Insights. This session will be moderated by Dr. Brittany Barreto, CEO, Fem Health Insights. Joining us on the panel are Dr. Alice Deng, Partner, Foreground Capital, Ms. Helen Tomlinson, Head of Inclusion, ADECO, Ms. Tomoko Minagawa, Founder and Representative Director, Femtech Community Japan, and Ms. Rhiannon Box, Assistant Secretary, Health Equity Branch, Department of Health, Disability and Aging of Australia. Now, Dr. Barreto, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Konnichiwa. I am Dr. Brittany Barreto, and I am a global femtech expert, or women's health innovation. And I'm so excited to be kicking off day 2 with you, talking about women's health. It's a huge global health issue right now, and I'm excited that Japan is taking such a focus on it. So before we have the panelists come out, I'd like to talk to you about some baseline statistics that you should all understand in order for us to get the conversation underway. The women are not all right. Women live 25% more of their lives in poor health compared to men. On average, that's 9 years in decline. And you may think, well, maybe women don't feel well because they have PMS and pregnancy and menopause. But research from McKinsey shows that only 5% of this unwellness is due to female-specific conditions. And instead, 95% of this unwellness stems from diseases that affect both sexes, but are disproportionately hurting women, such as migraines, autoimmune conditions, bone health, brain health, heart health. And so even if a woman is unwell, she still needs to get treatment. And so this is part of the reason why we're seeing this unwellness. It's because of delayed diagnosis, side effects due to drugs, and ineffectiveness of drugs in women. 65% of medical interventions are less effective in women than in men. For example, asthma inhalers are 20% less effective in women than in men. Rheumatoid arthritis medications are 24% less effective in women than in men. But this is assuming that you've already had a diagnosis. That is actually a huge hurdle in women's health. In fact, women experience delayed diagnosis for over 700 conditions. For 700 conditions, women are not being diagnosed on time. In fact, on average, they're diagnosed 4 years later than their male counterparts for the same conditions. And let's say they do get a diagnosis and they are put on medication that isn't working as well for them, they also have side effects. Women are 50 to 75% more likely to have side effects from drugs than men. And medication withdrawals from the market due to safety concerns are 3.5 times more likely to be retracted from the market due to safety issues within women. How did we get here? Why is medicine not working for women? It's because we have a history of science and medicine without females. If we look all the way down to the basic cellular models that we use to understand biology, 75% of cell lines we use in research are male only. Meaning when we're screening for drugs that might cure cancer, we're using male cells, and we might be missing drugs that could work in female cells. Or when we're analyzing the morphology of neurons to understand things like Alzheimer's, which disproportionately affects females, but we're using male cells, we might be missing the biological markers that are the key to unlocking understanding neurodegeneration. Animal models are even worse. 95% of animal models are male only. This is due to scientists assuming that female hormones might affect their data. What this has resulted in is us studying female health conditions in male animals. Scientists literally put a uterus into male mice to study endometriosis. a uterine health condition that affects 10% of women worldwide. They actually found a cure for this condition, but when they went to female humans, it failed miserably. When our backdrop to scientific discovery and healthcare innovation is based on a male paradigm, when we translate that into female humans, we miss the mark. Speaking of humans, women were not included in the United States clinical trials until 1993 and not required until 2016. This means we don't even have a decade's worth of research on female humans. What's more is that less than 1% of healthcare research dollars is dedicated to women's health. This is not only insulting, but it's illogical, because women's health is big business. The economic impact of women's health is immense. Closing this gap between men and women's health is a $1 trillion per year opportunity. For every $1 invested in women's health, you get a $3 return. And that's because improving women's health improves everybody's health: men's, children's, communities, employers, businesses, governments, countries. In fact, 80% of the gains we could make in women's health come from improving women's health during their working age years. We have never had such a high percentage of women working in the workforce than ever before. And their painful periods, their hormone-induced migraines, their menopause symptoms are leading them to leave the workforce or have low productivity. In fact, 10% of women retire early due to menopause symptoms. So a company that has invested all this money into a female trainee to get her through her career, hoping she ends up in leadership, may lose all of their investment because she retires early due to symptoms. That's why we have today the rise of femtech. Again, femtech is innovation in women's health and wellness. It's solutions to conditions that solely, disproportionately, or differently affect females. Today, there's about 1,700 active femtech startups in the world globally. A few of them, we actually have one pitching later today. Bloom Life is a remote monitor for high-risk pregnancies. Clue is a period tracking app used by over 40 million women globally. Eli Health is an at-home hormone test. They're creating the first continuous female hormone monitor, similar to the glucose monitor, but for female hormones. They just closed a $12 million round. And Ember Labs, I'm actually wearing their bracelet right now. It's a bracelet that interacts with your nervous system and prevents hot flashes during menopause. Last year, over $2.6 billion was invested in femtech. And this is a great number because it used to be barely anything. So we're getting there, but we need a lot more. And it's not only because women deserve it, but because investors should see the return opportunity, because the average women's health exit is worth $348 million. The average tech exit is $250 million. So about $100 million more for femtech exits, and their average time to exit is 4.5 years. The reason that it's so quick, the average tech exit is 8 years. The reason femtech is so quick is because of that 1% in healthcare research dollars. Pharmaceutical companies are very public to say they do not do women's health research, but they acquire women's health solutions. And so as soon as a femtech company has some decent data on their human safety and their clinical trials, they're getting acquired faster. And so if you're an investor, this is an opportunity to make big returns in a quick turnaround time. And with that, now we laid a little bit of groundwork. Now you understand the current state of affairs in women's health. I'd like to introduce our panelists, if they could please come out now. Dr. Alice Zhang, she's the partner at Foreground Capital. She'll be speaking to us about venture capital and the United States market. Helen Tomlinson, she's the former government menopause employment champion. She'll be talking to us about the United Kingdom market and workplace health for women. Tomoko Minagawa, she is the founder of Femtech Community Japan and also works at Organon, a leading pharmaceutical company in women's health. And Rhiannon Box, she's the Assistant Secretary, Australian Government. Today, she's going to talk to us about the Australian market and government involvement in women's health. Welcome, panelists. So excited to have you up here. All right. Alice, let's kick it off with you. And because each of you have a specific vertical that you're going to speak to us about today, we're going to focus on each panelist individually, but please comment if anyone wants to jump in. But we're going to focus kind of 10 minutes for each person. So first, let's talk about the United States and venture capital. Alice, what are some of the latest trends in women's health and femtech products and services?
Great. Well, thank you, first of all, to the organizers for bringing us all here. I am so honored to be participating, and I'm thrilled to see women's health on the main stage agenda. And thank you, Brittany, for the wonderful slides to help set the tone here. By way of introduction, my name is Alice. I'm a partner with Foreground Capital, which is an early stage VC fund investing exclusively in women's health. There are a handful of us out there. And I've actually been in this space for my whole career as a clinician, as a public health practitioner, as a patient myself, and actually spent a bit of time at McKinsey with some of the reports and statistics that Brittany had highlighted. So trends in women's health is something I've been following for several years now, and I'm delighted to say that we are really at an exciting inflection point. There's a couple ways to look at it. One is where is the innovation? Where are companies spending their time and developing solutions? In this sense, I would say first there's a broadening in the scope of what is women's health. Many of the innovations, 7 to 10 years ago, were really focused on specific parts of reproductive health, and the definition of women's health is also expanded from the female exclusive parts of women's health to include, as Brittany said, things that affect women differently and disproportionately. And we are also seeing the innovation pipeline grow in that way as well. Some other trends about the pipeline, as VCs, we call them pipeline. For everybody else, the innovation sector. Other things are that there is much more digital health than the life sciences, and some of that has to do with our understanding of basic biology within many women's health conditions. It is improving, but you would need that early stage research to develop druggable targets, to then develop drugs, et cetera. So within the life sciences, I would say that we do see more devices and diagnostics than therapeutics. Another trend, whether you're on the digital side or on the life science side, is this idea of putting the consumer at the center. And so that could mean new technologies, or it can be new ways of reaching the patient, or both, that really gives women the power to really manage their own health. So for example, new technology to enable at-home saliva-based hormone testing, which is what Ellie Health that Brittany had highlighted does, or taking a solution that's already available, but enabling the woman to access it on her own, such as breast cancer screening, doing that without needing a physician's prescription or going to an office. So this idea of disrupt the paradigm and enable at-home care or self-directed care is a big trend. In terms of other trends around women's health and innovation, I would say the public awareness and sentiment has really changed a lot in the US and hopefully globally as well. So 3 or 4 years ago, for the first time ever, in a very male-dominated sport, football, in the Super Bowl, there was an advertisement for a drug for menopause. And that would have been unimaginable even just the year before that, where menopause, even in the medical community, is not taught at all. And women don't really know what's happening to their bodies, and their doctors aren't able to provide solutions. So that type of destigmatization is a trend that we're seeing. There are many celebrities that have come out very publicly about pregnancy issues, about menopause, and other conditions they're facing, and corporations as well. And the other part of what's actually growing as well is the ecosystem. So there's innovators and then there's investors, but there's also other events that are popping up that didn't exist before, incubators, research initiatives, and it is really important to highlight the investors because it's not just small funds that are specialized like us. We are seeing the generalists, the multi-billion, large funds get into the game as well. And of course, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is around funding and exits, because we don't care about women's health just for the the broader societal economic impact and gender equity, but because it's a good business opportunity. When you have conditions, as Brittany mentioned, that affect 10% of women, that's more prevalent than diabetes, for example, and yet no solutions, that means that there's very little competition, and if you can develop a solution that works, that's a huge market opportunity to capture. So we are seeing increased funding, which I can give some more specifics as well, and exits as well are continuing to rise.
Perfect. Let's just jump into that. Tell us about the funding for women's health. How's that going?
So I'll speak to VC funding in particular. Of course, there's other sources of funding as well, but we can't talk about women's health VC without looking at the overall VC landscape. And just to paint a picture of what's happening there, which I'm sure folks who are outside of US and Europe probably feel as well, as the global economy is tied together, but we are in a low in venture capital funding in general, where during COVID in 2021, and early 2022, VC funding really spiked quite a bit and now has dropped down to levels that are the lowest it's been for several years, and as of the end of last year has just started to uptick again. So we are hopeful, cautiously optimistic, but funding is tight and many companies are having a hard time raising. In fact, there's a lag as well. There are thousands of companies that shut down in 2023, and then more that shut down in 2024, and there's a lag because you can raise bridge rounds to keep yourself going, but it's hard to raise that next kind of proper round, and so it's a time of reckoning. So just to set the stage of, it's a very tough time for funding. Despite that, women's health is actually doing well, I would say. We're holding strong, and what I mean is there's some great data from the Silicon Valley Bank. They had this big report, I think Brittany referenced some of their data, and they looked at funding trends, and if you track back 5 years to 2019, if you look at that as a reference point, healthcare investing increased in COVID and then has dropped back down to maybe 60% more of where it was 5 years ago. Women's health VC funding increased, experienced some headwinds as every other sector and has actually held steady, and it's about over 3 times the level of investment as there was 5 years ago. So despite this challenging environment, women's health is doing well, and is also, there's been an expansion as a share of total healthcare investing as well, from 1.5% in 2020 to 4.5% this last year.
As a fellow American, we cannot talk about the United States landscape without talking about the Trump administration. Under the Biden administration, he dedicated $100 million to a women's health initiative. What has happened with that? What are some of the changes we're seeing under this administration that isn't necessarily promoting diversity or an inclusion or women's health for that matter? And how is that affecting the industry with the change?
We could have a whole panel on that conversation. It is very complex and multifaceted, but to really maybe just drill it down to the core parts. So first, your question is, what did the Biden administration do? And we in this space are very thankful for all that Joe Biden and Jill Biden did for women's health. And I would say it's actually more about elevating the space and creating a platform for awareness rather than actual funding. So there was $100 million dedicated to what was called a Sprint for Women's Health, and that was run through ARPA-H, which is a government agency. And that $100 million, they ran this VC pitch-like competition. I think 2,000 startups applied. In the end, there were maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20 awarded. That capital has been awarded and granted, so that is not being reversed. President Biden had also made some other executive orders and announcements around women's health funding that were in the $1 billion range, but that was actually more counting what was already being done and summing it up rather than net new capital. So the fact that Trump administration came in, they're not continuing the White House initiative, that doesn't necessarily change the funding. That alone does not change the funding for women's health materially, although of course it's very sad that we don't have the same type of political support. So Jill Biden has now actually gone on to support the Milken Institute. They have this new women's health network, so her work is continuing in other ways. Your other question is, how has the Trump administration affect women's health? So this question is something we actually get a lot. We're fundraising, and that's probably the first question we get from all of our new investors. And I would say for most things, women's health faces very similar headwinds as all the rest of healthcare. The Trump administration has cut down on NIH dollars across the board, not just for women's health, but for everybody. There's a dismantling of science in general, not just in women's health. The FDA staff is cut short. So all of these changes are felt in women's health just as every other space. And what I would say maybe is more unique is on the DEI side, which actually does affect other sectors as well. There's a rollback of DEI. It's become a not great word. And I'll just give an example. We have a company in ovarian cancer, which affects people with people with ovaries, which are generally women or those born with biologically female organs. And they were submitting a journal article, and the article had to get run through an AI tool to check for diversity words, to make sure they weren't there and catch them, take them out. And the word woman got flagged. And so it's a bit tough because this is a condition that affects women. And so that just gives you an example of just kind of how ludicrous in some ways that this has gone. And so for some of our companies, the mission doesn't change, but how you talk about it might have to, just in the short term. And then, of course, reproductive rights is one very unique part of women's health that is different for political impact right now. And it's nuanced. For maternal health, Project 2025 actually supports doulas, which is great. And Trump wants to be the king of IVF, so great. And abortion is really the area that is most deeply impacted.
Well, a lot of things happening in the United States in so many areas, so many fronts, women's health definitely being one of them. Helen, let's go to you and talk about the role of women's health in the workplace. As I had in some of those slides, this is a major call to action for everybody, all stakeholders, to talk about women's health in the workplace. So why is women's health in the workplace a growing topic? Why is this, a movement happening now?
Thank you for that. So just by way of introduction, my name is Helen Tomlinson. I was the UK government's first ever menopause employment champion under our previous government. And I was given the role to really champion women's health at that pivotal stage in career. You mentioned earlier about 10% of women retiring early because of their menopause symptoms. And that is a real privilege to be able to do that. Not everybody can be afforded to do that. So it was a business imperative and a governmental imperative in the UK to retain female talent in the workforce and actually encourage women who'd left the workforce, particularly during COVID, and now are in receipt of benefits, who were at that pivotal stage, to come back into the workforce. So encouraging employers to be menopause friendly, women's health friendly, etc. So yeah, an absolute imperative that happened. At the same time that I was appointed, I was lobbying government to make it a legal requirement to have a menopause policy for all organisations of above 250 people. And that's now in our current government's employee rights bill plan, which will go through next year. So whilst it is an action plan, not a policy, it's really focusing on women's health. So that was the role that I was doing for the government for 18 months, the previous government. But what that allowed me to do was create a platform to be able to talk about all aspects of women's health in the workplace and why it's so important from a cultural perspective that those are addressed. And I introduced the 4 pillars of cultural change, which, whilst policy is super important, I would now say it actually ends with the policy and not starts with the policy. Because if you introduce those 4 pillars of cultural change, which are education, allyship, lived experience and leadership, the reliance on policy is actually far less. So just changing that dynamic and that focus. But it absolutely is a business imperative for us to retain female talent in the workplace.
You mentioned something that I would like to know more about. What is a menopause action plan?
So a menopause action plan can include things like, ideally, education, so training and upskilling in the workplace. So there's a real fear, I would say, in some areas of business, a bit like Alice was saying, that it really wasn't a topic that was talked about, and it was revolutionary for it to be an advert at the Super Bowl. We had a similar situation in the UK where there are parts of business that just don't talk about it. So it could be a particular sector, or it could just be a particular organisation where women feel that they would rather leave their job than have a conversation with their line manager about what they are experiencing. So education is really important. So
Maybe quickly for our audience, maybe some of them don't know how menopause symptoms affect a woman in the workplace.
Okay.
What are some examples of how it might be preventing or being productive or present?
There are 45 known symptoms of menopause, and they can be really broken down into those physical symptoms, things like hot flashes that you just mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, and that I've never seen that before, so I'm really
I'll
excited.
let you borrow it later.
Really
Yeah.
excited to see that. So for somebody who's HRT, got left on a plane in Dubai for 3 days, I could have really have done with that the first 3 days of being here. So things like hot flashes, night sweats, really heavy and irregular periods. So 44% of women really struggle with heavy bleeding long term throughout perimenopause. So that can really impact on going into work, essentially. But some recent research has just come out in the UK. 20,000 women filled in a survey, and the highest symptom that came out of that was actually brain fog. And that is something that can affect all women. But I found that I was working in a remote role when I was going through perimenopause, and the symptoms that really affected me were around brain fog, anxiety, loss of confidence. So they can either be physical symptoms or they can be more psychological and cognitive symptoms.
Thank you so much for expanding on that. Sometimes we just gotta also tell people what we're referring to, right?
Yeah, of course.
So we're talking a lot about menopause, but is menopause just kind of the entryway for us to talk about women's health in the workplace? What are other verticals of women's health in the workplace that employers should be considering?
So what I started to do was talk more broadly about women's health, and I never really go out and just speak about menopause now. I talk about women's health holistically. So that can be hormonal health, physical health, mental health, and actually financial health as well, because that underpins from a lot of that. But yeah, it was absolutely our entry point. And when the British Standards Institute brought out their international standard on menstrual health, menopause in the workplace, that really opened up that opportunity to talk about hormonal health and introduce that as a thread that runs through the whole career. So we started off talking about menopause, but we now openly talk about periods, endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, PMDD, fertility, coming back into the workplace, early onset menopause, etc. So it really opened up that opportunity. And whilst Femtech in the UK is predominantly focused on fertility and menopause, that just shows where the scope is and the opportunity. We represent 3.8% of the global femtech space in the UK, so definitely room for opportunity there.
Alice, you want to add something?
Absolutely. It's fascinating to hear that in the UK, the workplace conversation started with menopause. And I just love that, because when I look in the US, it actually really started more around reproduction. So a lot of it was about maternal health benefits, things from milk shipping to a Maven, for example, which supports you between visits. And then it moved into kind of parenting, early childhood, moved upstream into fertility, and then finally recently it's been getting to menopause. So interesting to hear that it was kind of the opposite.
And I think it absolutely was, because it was that business imperative that there were, significant proportion of women who were economically inactive. It was a drive by the government to get those women back into the workplace and retain female talent when, we are hearing that 1 in 10 women have left their job because of their experience of menopause, because they felt it was easier to leave than start a conversation with their line manager or with, a menopause champion in the workplace, or even with their GP. So it was great that they had the knowledge, but how they expressed that knowledge or not, as the case may be, was really challenging.
The purpose of this conference is to find solutions around the world that are working and create cross-pollination and partnerships. Is there a country that's doing women's health in the workplace really well? And it could be the UK, maybe, but is there some examples that the Japanese government and employers could learn?
I think, being really honest, and I'm a very, very humble person, but I know we are doing it in the UK probably faster, maybe not from a femtech perspective, because I don't see a massive amount of technology in this space at the moment, but certainly from a conversation, from a governmental drive, from a business imperative, from a business initiative, I do see us opening up that conversation. But one of my 4 key pillars of focus is that international piece, because we can always learn from other countries. And what I'm taking away from being here is that actually introducing technology into the process will really support women in looking after themselves, because I think there has been a real drive about what can my employer do for me as an individual, when actually there's so much that you can do for yourself. There's a great reliance on HRT, a lot of conversation around HRT, and actually if you take HRT but you don't have a focus on nutrition, physical activity, sleep, lifestyle choices, etc., it's not going to solve the challenge that you're facing. So I think having the empowerment to use femtech to support your own lived experience and your own, I hate the word journey, but I'm going to say it, your own journey is really important.
Wow, thank you so much. Tomoko, let's go over to you. Speaking of the Japanese market, what are some of the unique women's health challenges in Japan?
Okay, yeah. Thank you for your question. So let me introduce a bit about myself before I go into the answers and discussion. So hi everyone, I'm Tomoko Minagawa. I'm a representative and founder of Femtech Community Japan, which is a kind of a non-profit organization and industry association regarding women's health, technology, and Femtech in Japan. So I started this organization 5 years ago when I was in VC industry, like Alice mentioned. I was an investor, and I met so many women entrepreneurs who are actually suffering, who had the experience to suffer from the women's health issues, and started to offer the solution through the entrepreneurial startups. So I met, it was almost first time for me to face these deep issues, and just I thought that I had to do something here. Then I started the events and learning sessions, inviting some people from outside, thought leaders, entrepreneurs. Then gradually, I found that all the enterprise companies, governments, and media came to us. They wanted to learn more. So gradually, I found the femtech women's health area were gradually attracting the attention from the others, and then I started this community. And on the other hand, I actually left the VC fund 3 years ago, and currently I'm the position to have the responsibility in the business creation in women's health in the global pharma Organon. And quickly introducing the Organon, I think everyone knows that the MSD Milk, which is the giant global pharma, and Organon is the spin-out company from Merck 4 years ago. And I joined the company, and currently I'm leading the women's health business in Organon, Japan, offering the women's health pharmaceutical products and solutions in the market. So sorry for a bit long introduction, but yeah, I really learned a lot from you too, regarding the US and UK happening, the things happening in women's health area. To be honest, I see so many topics and issues we totally share in common. But I could say some of the topics are totally unique in Japan. Sorry. Let me check, sorry. The first thing is that I think when you compare the kind of European Western culture and Asian Japanese culture, people have a more strong stigma and taboo concept regarding the women's health, especially for the reproductive health issue. So, and in maybe Japanese people tend to endure hardships without complaining before they find really they can't stand, and that is kind of considered virtue. So this leads to the situation that people don't really seek the solutions or medical support while they can, start receiving the treatment if they start like making actions. So that's like one thing. And probably related to this first topic, probably the education and the knowledge, kind of like literacy in the women's health area should be more, matured. So we don't have any specific and probably the utilized knowledge in terms of women's health, reproductive health in schools or like the workplace. So recently, government like started, promoting to expand women's knowledge as social-wide to in their workplace and schools. So third thing I could say, Japan unique thing, is that the government policies, as you mentioned, you have already started like funding or big initiatives in your countries. Japan probably like also trying to catch up with all the other markets. So from 3-4 years before, Japanese national government started including the women's health initiatives or femtech solutions in their basic policy to empower women. So all the startups or the enterprise companies currently already started to think that this is really important for like Japanese society.
What convinced them that women's health was important to consider? Was there a report that came out? Was there, some conference that happened or a new political party in power? Like, what was the catalyst that got Japanese companies to start to consider women's health as a priority?
And one thing is that the like social pressure to the enterprise companies in terms of the gender gap in workplace. As everyone knows here, Japan is ranked really low in terms of the gender gap ranking, especially among the OECD countries. And that's also is the big issue for like nationwide in terms of the to secure the workforce, because we are a shrinking population, aging society, and also we have very low birth rate. So one of the measures the government tried to capture is to engage more women, even they have baby, they have kids, family, or like having some symptoms of menopause, menstrual, trying to support them to keep them in the workforce to perform to support our business development. So that's the big trend the government is currently focusing on.
And you also work for Organon, so you're seeing, femtech startups at their earliest stage, but you're also working at one of the largest pharmaceutical companies focused, if the largest, focused on women's health. What are some of Organon's priorities as it comes to women's health in East Asia, Japan?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I'm not the position to discuss some details about the strategy of Organon because I'm here as the Femtech Committee Japan's president. But yeah, I'm really happy to share the mission vision of Organon Global. So Organon is a unique only company, like global pharma company, which is focusing on women's health. And especially when I talk about the Japan market, in Japan, we actually have a couple of like pharmaceutical products offering in this market, and in Japan, our focus is definitely the fertility treatment. Maybe everyone on the stage knows, but maybe we explain about the situation in Japan. Japanese government started to expand the coverage of national reimbursement in fertility treatment 3 years ago because of the very low birth rate, and started to support couples or women to have their family babies. And Organon, we have 2 products to support couples to have to receive the fertility treatment, and we really want to support the Japanese society through our solution. So that's our main focus. But when it comes to the global strategy or mission of global Organon, we do not only focus on specific issues of women's health. As Helen mentioned, women's health issues are all connected based on the hormone up and down, and it continues whole women's life from stage to stage. So as Organon, we are focusing to support women's health for them to have healthier, better life. And probably that means to support not only the women themselves, but also the people around them, including families or friends, and maybe the colleagues. So that's our solution. So we do not focus on specific areas such as period, endometriosis, fertility, menopause, but we are trying to cover all the products. So maybe a couple of years later, we can share more pipelines and products we are focusing on. But yeah, that's the the strategy of Organon.
Well, speaking of the future, my last question for you is, what do you think the next 5 to 10 years the femtech and women's health market looks like in Japan?
Yeah, I think my wish, I hope we could see more and more startups, enterprise companies, and players focusing on this area will be active, to offer more solutions and products in Japan. But in order to realize that situation in Japan, I don't think we can only achieve these the ideal environment by ourselves. Probably we definitely need the collaboration and the support from the players at the market and global, from such as US, UK, Australia, maybe Asian markets, and to develop better and more holistic solutions. One thing I could say is that in Japan currently we have somehow more femcare products, which is not engaged deeply of the technology, but more or less focusing on the women's health products. But it's also important to expand the business and solutions in tech-based innovations in order to really solve the deep issues of women's health. So probably to accelerate that health tech, women's health tech innovation, we definitely need the collaboration and build the ecosystem, not only from the business side, government side, startup side, but also the academia or the medical practitioners, investors. Then we can raise more better discussion and better to create the future society.
Thank you so much, Tomoko. I'd have to agree that partnerships in femtech for the Japanese market is one of the strongest forms of partnerships I've seen within any countries. I've seen several femtech companies still working on their US FDA approval, and yet they have expanded to the Japanese market because the Japanese government is so motivated to get fertility and maternal health, in particular, solutions into the Japanese market, that they're accelerating their approval process and getting translations and getting clinical trials done. So I actually see a huge opportunity for femtech companies around the world to come to Japan because of the motivation here to get solutions locally.
Yeah, you can expect so much support from government, probably including the local, not only national government, but local government, and probably all the enterprise companies are eager to work with the global tech innovative companies in order to, create new value and solutions to the market. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rhiannon, let's chat about Australia. We've gone around the world, United States, United Kingdom, Japan. Let's go to Australia. In what ways, and by the way, why don't you just remind our audience your position and your role, and then tell us in what ways has the Australian government recognized the importance of women's health?
Thank you, Brittany, and hi everyone. My name is Rhiannon Box. I am from the Federal Department of Health, Disability and Ageing in Australia. And like my colleagues on the panel, I would like to echo their sentiments in thanking the organisers of this event in having a focus on women's health at this event. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about the Australian government's very strong commitment and very strong agenda on women's health.
What are some of the unique challenges in Australia?
So, as you said, look, Australia is really committed to addressing some of the very unique challenges in women's health in Australia. As you put so eloquently at the beginning of this presentation, women's health is important not just for improving the lives of individuals, but it also has benefits for families, children, employers, businesses, societies, communities, and countries. Women's health is a really important area of focus for the Australian government. Australia is a really big and diverse country. I'm not as humble as you, Helen, so I'm going to go out and say that Australia has one of the best health systems in the world. We're very proud of our health system in Australia. Medicare is our universal health scheme, and that's been around in Australia since 1984, so it's recently turned 40. And the healthcare in Australia is high quality, safe and affordable. But as I said, Australia is a really large country and health outcomes for people are not equitable across all groups of people in Australia. So one of the key challenges for women's health in Australia is access to health services. And we really see that reflected in the data. So Australia, the majority of the population lives along the eastern seaboard of Australia, but women in regional towns and rural and remote areas can have challenges with accessing the health services that they need. So we see in the data around 50% less access to Medicare services in remote areas, and people in remote areas are using less specialists, dentists and GPs. It's also an issue for women trying to find maternity care services and birthing services in rural and remote areas. And we see that reflected in poorer maternal and neonatal outcomes for people living in those areas. Another challenge that the Australian government is trying to address in Australia is cost. So women tend to use more health services than men in Australia, which means higher out-of-pocket costs for women. But we also see in the data that women are foregoing health services. So 1 in 10 women in Australia have reported delaying or not filling a prescription due to cost, and around 40% of women have reported not seeing a health professional when they needed to because of cost. And that can be particularly hard for single mothers, for example, who are prioritising their children's health needs above their own. And the last challenge I'd like to talk to you about is one that Australian government is working very hard to address is sex and gender bias in the healthcare system, which you talked about at the beginning of this presentation, Brittany. So a recent survey of Australian women found that 2 out of 3 women in Australia have experienced gender bias or discrimination when accessing health services. This can lead to misdiagnosis, dismissal of symptoms or delayed interventions. For example, in Australia, 1 in 7 women are living with endometriosis, but on average, it takes between 6 to 8 years for a woman to be diagnosed. So what is the Australian government doing about this? The Australian government has released its national women's health strategy in 2020. And as you were saying to Moko, women's health needs change over the course of their life. And the women's health strategy really does take that life stage approach, recognising the changing health needs of women from puberty through their reproductive and working years through to menopause and end of life and aged care. So it also recognises sex and gender as a key health determinant and recognises the differences in disease risks and prevention strategies and access challenges for women.
Well, we talked about with Alice that the United States dedicated $100 million, which was a great start to women's health, but Australia just blew that out of the water with $792 million dedicated to women's health. Tell us more about this initiative.
That's right. So in March this year, the Australian government handed down their budget, and that included one of the largest ever investments in women's health, which, as you said, was $792 million, so nearly $800 million in women's health funding. What makes it innovative is its comprehensive and integrated approach to women's health. So, as I said, it takes sort of that life course approach to women's health, considering what women need across the different stages of their lives. And it looks towards making treatments and medicines cheaper, affordable and more accessible to women over the course of their lives. So very excitingly, for the first time in 30 years, we had new oral contraceptives added to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So the pharmaceutical benefits scheme is the Australian government scheme that subsidises prescription medications in Australia. We also had new endometriosis treatments and menopause therapies added to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. There is funding going towards national trials of pharmacists being able to prescribe oral contraceptives and treat non-complicated UTIs for women, which will make accessing these services much more convenient for women and also will alleviate pressure on GP services. We have got funding going towards establishing specialist endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics in every jurisdiction across Australia. So we currently have 22 endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics already established, and this funding will go towards expanding that to an additional 11 clinics, bringing the total to 33 clinics across Australia. And this is really filling a gap of access and treatment for women who are experiencing those chronic conditions like endometriosis. And there is a lot of funding going towards menopause treatments and menopause initiatives. So we have a new Medicare rebate for a menopause health assessment. We've got the first ever clinical guidelines being developed for menopause in Australia. We've got GP training initiatives. We've got subsidies for menopausal hormonal treatments. And we will have our first ever national campaign raising awareness for perimenopause and menopause in Australia.
Women's health has always been here. It's just recently that we figured out we could apply technology to it, make investment in it, right? Previously, women's health has really been focused on within nonprofits and local community groups. And so what's your experience in collaborating with nonprofits and local communities to create these new health policies?
So I guess, as I said before, Australia is a very large and diverse country. So whenever government is designing any type of policy, it's very, very important that we work in collaboration and listen to and consult with local people, local communities, and not-for-profit groups representing different groups of people. So it's really important for us to understand the different cultural and geographic context in which women are using health systems. It's also really important for us to understand the lived experiences of different groups of women, like women with disability, LGBTIQA+ women, women experiencing family and domestic violence, so that we can design health services that will meet the needs of all women in Australia. So the government has recently established a National Women's Health Advisory Council that does have representation from academia, peak medical bodies, consumers, importantly, and the not-for-profit sector representing different groups like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, LGBTIQA+ groups, multicultural women's groups, and women from rural Australia. And this group, the council recently, so in 2024, they convened a National Women's Health Summit. And that really was brought together to hear about the lived experiences of different groups of women, so that could help inform and shape government policies. And the outcome of that summit really helped to shape the recent funding investment that has been made by the Australian government.
And let's share some successful policies or programs that have effectively improved women's health.
Yeah, great. So I think a really great example that I'd love to share with you today is the very successful National Cervical Cancer Screening Program in Australia. So that was rolled out in 1991 in Australia, and very quickly we saw really positive outcomes from that measure, which saw incidence and mortality rates of cervical cancer in Australia drop by about 45 to 50%. But very quickly after that, those outcomes plateaued. And what we were also seeing in the data, that there were certain groups of women who weren't accessing cervical screening as much as other groups of women, and they were groups of women like women with disability, LGBTIQA plus women, women living in really rural and remote areas. So the government, the government's very ambitious about eliminating cervical cancer in Australia, and I think they've set a target of eliminating cervical cancer by 2035. So to really drive a push towards this, in 2022, the Australian government rolled out self-testing kits of cervical cancer in Australia, and we saw some really impressive results. So by the end of 2023, 27% of all tests were self-collected, and 54% of all tests were self-collected in remote areas of Australia. So the other great outcome that we had there was the percentage of first-time people being tested rose very dramatically from about 13% to 40%. And in that group of people having tests done for the first time were those really hard-to-reach groups like women with disability, women from rural and remote areas, women who have experienced trauma, women who typically were avoiding going to have a cervical screening done. So that's a really great example of a policy that's really improved health for women.
Amazing. We have a few more minutes, and again, this conference is all about partnerships and cross-collaboration. What is one thing you can either offer or ask of the audience in terms of how you'd like to partner with somebody here, whether they're in Japan or they're visiting from another country? What's something that you'd like to work on with another collaborator here? And we'll just quickly go down. Would you like to kick us off?
Well, I guess the government is really investing in femtech in Australia. There's government funding going towards supporting femtech and female leadership in health tech related industries. So I guess the Australian government really wants to see more investment and female leadership in this space, and is really investing particularly in, pushing women forward in typically male-dominated industries to see women's leadership in this space. So
Awesome.
I think,
So you want to meet startups and new people researching and maybe even coming to Australian market.
absolutely.
Great. Tomoko, what can people come to talk to you about?
Hi, thank you. So I'm really happy to see this amount of many people are here to listen, show your interest to listen to what's happening in women's health. So I think in Japan we have a very good healthcare system, very good healthcare companies, enterprise companies, and also startups. And probably the researchers are also working very actively in this area. So of course not only in Japan and globally. So I just hope everyone in this innovative domain can take a bit time to think about what you can do in women's health area. So in Japan, I really see the big needs to accelerate this area, but it can't be done only for the people who are already in this area. We definitely need thought leaders, policy makers, investors, researchers, maybe medical practitioners, all the thought leaders from cross sectors to be involved in this area. So yeah, I'm really too happy to have this opportunity and start collaboration with all the people here.
So everyone, regardless of what you work on, should ask themselves, what's my role in women's health? Excellent. Helen.
So as I said earlier, we have 3.8% of the global market. There is a lot of opportunity there for that to increase. I'd be really interested in speaking to anybody who wants to support us in increasing that. As you probably know, we have an incredible national health service in the UK, which provides free health for everybody. However, it is hugely stretched, hugely overworked. And for me, the importance of women's health is for everybody, all women everywhere, making it equitable, not just for those who can afford to buy products.
Beautiful. And Alice.
Great. I wish I could say wonderful things about our health system, but that is not the case. But wonderful to hear. So as a venture capital fund, there's two things we prioritize. One is finding great startups to invest in. We actually have Bloom Life from our portfolio that Brittany also mentioned here with us. So check out their booth over in the next room. So yeah, looking for startups that are innovating in women's health in that broad definition, seed to Series A stage. We do have a US market focus, but the companies can be based elsewhere. And the other big priority for us is fundraising. So if there are any interested LPs that would like to speak more, would love to do that. And what I can offer to anybody outside of those groups is really, I spent many years looking at all the data in women's health, from investments to disease burden, et cetera. And the good news is there's a growing number of reports. So happy to speak with anyone if you're looking for specific types of data or you want to get to know the landscape. My top two recommendations are the McKinsey and World Economic Forum report from 2024, and then the SVB report from 2025.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for a very empowering and inspiring discussion. Please give a big round of applause to our stellar panel.